Before asking if anyone in the audience has a question for the two ministers, Dr. Jaishankar, a lot of your commentary was focused on democracy and furthering democracy and different forms of democracy. There are occasional comments that we see on the undermining of democracy in India, most recently in the context of the BBC, and just yesterday at the Munich Security Conference, George Soros spoke on many issues, but specifically on open and closed societies, and called on institutional reform in India. How do you, as Foreign Minister of India, explain this when you're dealing with your Quad ministers in particular, as well as others?
Well, look, I actually made 2 points. One, how the world is changing. It is rebalancing. It is less Euro-Atlantic. I don't think everybody gets that. I think old habits die hard. I mean, very candidly, there are still people in the world who believe that their definition, their preferences, their views must override everything else. So, since you mentioned this specific example, I don't know how familiar people are with what was said at the Munich conference. Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. By the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous, because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives. I spoke about globalization. Now, what globalization does is it actually creates a lot of the seamlessness of globalization, which creates all the opportunities, also allows narratives to be shaped, money to come in, foundations to go about their agenda. Now, in this particular case, I mean, it is very clear that he has very strong political preferences. He actually thinks that, I mean, doesn't matter that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, we are almost there, whose voters decide how the country should run. He actually thinks, well, if, and again, I cite him as an extreme example, okay, but there are other, manifestations of this in different countries, where people like him think an election is good if the person we want to see wins. If the election throws up a different outcome, then we actually will say it's a flawed democracy. This to my and the beauty is all this is done under the pretense of advocacy of open society, of transparency, etc. So our generation, we have grown up with concepts like regime change, which influence operations. Now, you can call it what you will. I mean, to me, this really looks the same, with a gloss of some kind of do-goodism on it. So, for me, it's actually necessary today that we have today a serious conversation on democracy. When I look at my own democracy, I mean, I have today a voter turnout which is unprecedented. electoral outcomes which are decisive, electoral processes which are not questioned. We are not one of those countries where after the election somebody goes to arbitrate in court. Okay? We don't have any hanging chads either. And where you actually say, I will sit in judgment over the verdict of voters. Now, my sense of democracy is the voter is supposed to decide. And it worries us because look, we are a country which went through colonialism. We know the dangers of what happens when there is outside interference in whatever guise in your politics. If you do this kind of scaremongering, like millions of people will be deprived of citizenship, it actually does real damage to our societal fabric, because somebody out there believes you, and you don't leave it to accident, by the way, you back it up with an operation. So you create that kind of fear psychosis, and then you use that to validate your original judgment. So I do think today between, whose democracy, whose globalization, why, the transparency of how global processes work. These are real issues which need to be debated.
Thank you, Ms. Benoit. I was going to ask you a renewable energy question, but with timing, might get one from the audience anyway. If it's okay, I'll got a couple of hands up. I think the Australia-India Business Council had the first question.
Kind of. I represent the Australia-India Chamber of Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce. Apologies.
Thank you. Anyway, also a worthy body. And thank you to both speakers. I have a question for Minister Bowen. India is as we know, a rapidly growing and developing nation, and it has great and growing energy needs, and I think currently has about 20 nuclear reactors. Am I right? Something like that. Is there any plans, or can we perhaps foreshadow?
We have 37 nuclear.
37. Okay.
I think so.
Okay. More than I thought.
Yeah.
At one point, Australia did export uranium to India. Is there any thought or any possibility, given that we export to other nations, that exports to uranium could go to India?
Well, there's certainly no impediment in terms of political party decisions once all the necessary arrangements have been made. So I wouldn't have envisaged any change in approach on a change of government on that matter. It's simply just working the issues through. But certainly there's absolutely no, I think, imperative if all the legal requirements under Australian law and Australian international obligations could be met. But I think there are certain treaty obligations which also need to be considered, which we would have to honour and we would have to be satisfied of. And that's a standard requirement across all trading partners. That's not a specific comment in relation to India.
I saw Gordon Flake all the way from Perth for the Rosina at Sydney. Fantastic to have you here, Gordon.
Delighted to make sure that we've got coverage from Australia's Indian Ocean capital. Gordon Flake with the Perth US Asia Centre. A question for Minister Jaishankar. I wonder if I might get your reaction to the comments that Minister Bowen made about the importance of renewable energy supply chains and his focus on India as a trusted and reliable partner par excellence. We had last year both your ministerial colleagues, Minister Joshi, Minister Goyal, visit. In October, the Japanese Prime Minister visited Western Australia with an intense focus on those clean energy supply chains, with the notion that the road to future energy went through Australia. I wonder if you might address and respond to Minister Bowen's comments in terms of how India views Australia when it comes to energy security and future energy.
I'm not an energy guy, but I'm a sort of jack of all trades. So I'll have a shot at the answer. My sense is a lot of countries are re-looking at their energy future. They're re-looking at the energy future for some of the reasons which Minister Bowen spoke about, that there's today a great deal of anxiety on the fossil fuel, on the accessibility, on the affordability, on the volatility of those markets. there's worry when it comes to renewables that, are we excessively dependent on particular geographies, and there could be disruptions there, but there could be leveraging there, call it what you will, but dependence is dependence. So to my mind, what happens, and what has happened even in the past, when the world starts getting nervous about a particular set of concerns, there's almost an intuitive sense in the world that let's go out there and look for different solutions, different arrangements, different transactions which will, as I said, de-risk all of us. I think when we, in our case, we are thinking about it very actively. We know we are not the only country which is thinking about it. It's also been a subject of conversation in the Quad, in other formats as well, I would say. And certainly we see Australia as a particularly important partner here, because if the future, we see the future as more renewable, we see the future as more nuclear, we see the future as more green hydrogen, green ammonia. Now, each of these, we see EV will mean the capital letters will become stronger with the passage of time. Or many of these roads do lead to Australia. So I do think that the energy side of our relationship, but I wouldn't put it just as energy. I would really put it as a kind of an economic security side of the relationship.